Hi everyone, my name is Jordan Frias and I am on the New England chapter, professional chapter of FPJ, Society of Personal Journalists Board. So currently serving as Secretary Treasurer, and with us we have two guests today to talk about transparency or lack thereof during COVID-19 pandemic. So I will introduce you both. So I'll start with Justin. Justin Silverman is the Executive Director of the New England First Amendment Coalition, which promotes and expands public access to government and the work it does. NEFAC speaks to advanced understanding of the First Amendment across the nation and freedom of speech and press issues around the world. So thank you for being with us, Justin.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
And then we have Todd Wallace. He is a data journalist and investigative reporter for the Boston Globe Spotlight team. Has covered a wide range of topics for the Globe, including secret criminal court hearings in Massachusetts, allegations of sexual abuse at private schools, overcrowded off-campus student housing, and Boston's stubborn reputation for racism. So thanks for being with us, Todd. How are you?
I'm doing well. Glad to be here.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. This is a really important topic, guys. So I just want to start off with a basic question to you both. Kind of when it comes to your line of work, what has changed since the pandemic hit? I'll start with Todd. I'll start with you first and Justin.
I think that it's forced people to try to get records in different ways than they used to. I think a lot of reporters and citizens are used to just showing up at a meeting in public and sitting in the back, and they have to figure out how to access them online. I think people are used to going into courthouses and seeing records, which they can't do. I think people are used to seeing items posted on government bulletin boards in person or talking to people, and now it's everything's online, and I think people are having to request a lot of information that they used to just be able to go into an office and see more readily.
Before I jump to you, Justin, can we go back to that, Todd? So can you just explain in your opinion, from your work, do you see a benefit to the focus on online versus in person? Why and why not?
Yeah, so there are obvious benefits. So one is now there is the ability to access meetings online no matter where you are. So in the past, it'd sometimes be really difficult for people to get to some meetings in person, and now it's much easier to access those online. In addition, I think there is an understanding by some government agencies that people can't see documents necessarily in person, and so they are finding ways to put that information online. So that is helpful. If it's online, that means not only can somebody see it who lives within a few miles and can physically go there, but people all over the region. And that's really important if, say, you're a reporter in Connecticut, but you want documents in Vermont or Maine or Massachusetts. It's much easier to try to get those online, and there are now more ways to do it, as well as accessing meetings. And the entire country as well as the world is going through this. So it's also easier to access documents in other parts of the country where traditionally they'd say, oh, you have to come in person.
Thank you for that, Todd. So Justin, now turning to you, can you talk about some of the differences in your work since the pandemic hit?
Sure. So a couple of things come to mind, one positive and one negative. Start with the negative, in that, especially early on in the pandemic, I think an excuse was given to government agencies to delay access to public records, to not grant the public access to open meetings where it could be otherwise. So we're really in the situation now, particularly in states that don't have a very good track record of transparency, Massachusetts being one of them, where we now have the pandemic that can be used, as a crutch by some, not all, but some government agencies to really delay public access. So that's an ongoing concern. I think a positive that has come out of this is we see a number of states and municipalities that are seeing what can be accomplished through remote meetings. And now all of a sudden we've really expedited this conversation about having meetings online, having remote accessibility, and providing information online that we weren't providing before. So in Maine, for example, for years, we've in Maine been pushing to have open meetings online and to have remote access. And now that the pandemic has forced, municipalities there to provide that access, now all of a sudden it's really given a lot more energy to that conversation. And I think that holds true through most states and municipalities. Now that we have this technology in place and we've been forced to use it, how can we continue to use it in a way that's going to be productive for everyone and ultimately provide more access than perhaps existed before the pandemic. So those are a couple of things that jump out where the pandemic has worked, both in a negative way, but perhaps a positive one moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, right, the Supreme Court's been online, right? Everyone's kind of excited about that, I guess I'm assuming some people are going to want that to continue. For an example of kind of what's positive about this waste that we've had to live with this pandemic. So Todd, can you bring up any negatives that you've experienced, that you've heard others have experienced in their work with this pandemic?
Yeah, so I have heard complaints that there's a feeling that some agencies are being slower about providing records. And I had an experience where I asked for some really basic records from an agency 6 weeks ago that ordinarily I would think they would be able to provide me right away. And they said, gosh, they're only accessible on a computer in our offices. We're not going there. So it's much more difficult. We have run into problems where people say our records only exist in paper form. And again, they're not in their offices. Some agencies also say that they've been swamped with requests. It's particularly public health agencies and police departments. And there are agencies that are either antiquated in their processes or using it as an excuse, but they do say, gosh, it is much harder for us to provide information with the pandemic going on.
And Justin, same question for you. Have there been some difficulties with the pandemic?
Sure. So I think a lot of the difficulties we've seen have come early on and continue in some respect, just through executive orders and the loosening of the loosening of standards that we need to comply with when it comes to the public records law and open meeting laws. Rhode Island is probably within the New England states, the worst offender, where at one point agencies were given up to 2.5 months to comply with public records. So unless you had a very good relationship with somebody at a government agency or were able to get that information through other means, you'd be waiting a while in order to get the information that you need. And I think that's one of the takeaways that I've had through this pandemic is that there, with the exception of maybe Connecticut and how they from almost the get-go really provided a lot of very specific data on a daily basis, and I think among all New England states probably did the best job right away of getting that data out to the public. Nearly everyone else, really sent the message that of all of our priorities right now, giving the public access to government just isn't one of them. We're going to make it easier for government officials and agencies to keep the public out and provide them more allowances than they should have, when in fact it should be just the opposite. When in times of crisis we need more information from the government, we need more access, and none of our leaders or governors, no one really took that stance. The message was sent: public records, open meetings, not a priority for us. We've got other things to think about, which really left the public in the dark. And moving forward, as hopefully we don't deal with another wave of COVID, but if we do, or if there's another pandemic in the future that we have to deal with, I hope we can take that lesson and really make sure that there are certain mechanisms in place where the public continues to have at least as much access as they did prior to the pandemic, if not more. And that that type of accountability and transparency really is given priority with everything else that the public needs.
I found it very interesting, Todd, that you mentioned, specific delays with COVID-related and police-related questions. Obviously, those are the topics of the day, topics of the hour, of the month. Can you give us any specific horror stories you've heard in terms of those two topics and what excuses have been given to reporters looking for that data?
So I'm sorry, you were specifically asking about COVID and difficulty obtaining data?
Well, COVID and the police department.
Okay.
You mentioned that there were those are two areas. Can you maybe
Yes.
mention the obvious of why and what examples you've seen or heard of?
Yeah. So there was just a report, and I forgot which nonprofit did it, that found that basically no state is being fully transparent when it comes to COVID data. Every state has areas where they're not providing data online that would be extremely useful both for the public and journalists and researchers trying to analyze how the virus is spreading, what's working in containing it. This information is really important, and the federal government is not collecting it all in one place. So it's really important that journalists and citizens be able to access it and cobble it together from different localities and states. States have gradually provided more information about testing and where it's happened, but a lot of it has been at the behest of newspapers and other media pushing the issue and pointing out that states are withholding key data that we need. And also lawmakers have put pressure. But as an example, Massachusetts, which now has more information in some ways than many states, still has yet to comply with a law that Governor Baker signed in early June, expanding access. So for instance, the last time I looked, they weren't reporting fully the number of deaths at assisted living facilities. They were reporting cases and sometimes deaths in broad categories, like more than 30 cases. So is that 200 cases? Is it 31? And it makes it really hard for health researchers who are trying to model how the virus is spreading and what states or homes are doing a good job or a poor job. It makes it really hard for families to know if their loved one is at risk. And that's a case where disclosure is specifically required by law. Unfortunately, there's a lot of gray area in public records, and agencies are taking advantage of that as well. So a lot of police departments have been reluctant to provide information on complaints against police officers. And sometimes they will cite really onerous fees. There are some states around the country, like West Virginia and Washington and Ohio, that don't let agencies, and California, that don't let agencies charge labor charges, an hourly fee to provide records. I believe every state in Massachusetts does. So many police departments are demanding tens of thousands of dollars for records about police officers, even at a time when there is huge interest in this, and not only from journalists, but the public as large and lawmakers, and this information's of huge interest. There tend to be a lot of exemptions in public records laws for various types of records, including for ongoing investigations, and many police departments are using those exemptions to try to withhold records as well. So it is a fight. Some of these battles are not new. The Globe, Boston Globe, for instance, sued state and local police for police reports and mugshots of police officers who were caught drunk driving, and a judge who was accused of stealing a Rolex watch at Boston Logan Airport. And we won that lawsuit in March, went all the way to the Supreme Court. It took, Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. It took 5 years to win that lawsuit. So it took many years and a lot of money. But with particular interest in these types of documents, we're seeing these battles happen again and again and again. And a lot of reporters and activists and citizens are tussling for these records. There were complaints recently in Waltham that the police department was charging people either hundreds or thousands of dollars to local residents who just wanted more information about how their police department's doing. So it's not, these battles are not restricted to journalists. There's a lot of people who are really interested right now in how their police departments are working, as well as how their public health departments are operating. And it can sometimes be a fight to try to get this detailed information.
Right, I can imagine that like years down the line, you get this information, it's going to be a little too late to report it, right? Like you said, it took 5 years for that lawsuit.
Yes, yeah, and I'm involved in a couple other lawsuits that have been pending for 5 years in Massachusetts, despite the fact that the law in Massachusetts specifically says that public records cases should be given a priority whenever possible. There have been other times when lawsuits have been very quick. Another challenge is that typically public records lawsuits have been filed by journalists and news media organizations, and news media organizations have less resources than they used to. It is hard for a lot of reporters to get approval from their supervisors and help to file a lawsuit. So that can be a big obstacle. Even though in most states in the country, there's a provision that allows news organizations to presumably win their legal fees if they're successful in a lawsuit. So if they have a good case, there are actually a ton of lawyers who are willing to take those cases pro bono or for free, just on the contingency that they are able to recoup their legal fees if they're successful. And it'd be great if more news organizations took advantage of that, because if public agencies never think they'll be taken to court, then they don't have any incentive to provide records other than if they care about embarrassment if people write about it. So lawsuits are really a powerful tool, but it is difficult in these times. It is also difficult because news organizations are having layoffs, they're having furloughs, so there are fewer journalists able to pay attention, able to attend meetings, able to take the time to file public records requests, able to have the institutional knowledge of how agencies work and relationships with people. Often the best tool that we have to get records is just knowing people at a city or town or agency and being able to explain to them why these records are helpful and ask for their help in providing them to us and the public as quickly as possible.
I think you did a great job laying out the challenges that a lot of organizations and reporters are facing. Justin, I mean, can you talk a little bit more about some of these challenges that people are facing to get information, and how are they choosing to battle those challenges?
Yeah, so just to go back to one thing that Todd mentioned about relationships, I can't emphasize enough just how valuable sourcing is and having relationships with those in government for situations like this. I spoke with a reporter in Rhode Island, and again, Rhode Island from very early on sent the message, we're not going to enforce the public records law. The governor was very standoffish about even access to her through briefings and questions she would take, all of which on its face looked very bad, and it was. But I spoke with at least one reporter who said, I'm still, for the most part, getting the information that I need because I have good relationships with these sources. I've been working with them in the past. And it just goes, to show you just how valuable that sourcing is. Now, that's not going to occur for everyone. Not everyone's within that community or has those types of relationships. But I do think that the current circumstances certainly put more of a burden on journalists to develop those relationships and make sure that they can get the information they need through other avenues. And that's what I've been seeing a lot are, reporters just relying on those sources and not making formal public records requests, but looking for workarounds to get the information that they need.
Well, Justin, what does that mean for the average citizen, though, or the organization that's not a news organization? How do they go about getting this information?
Yeah, it's a problem, and it's I think in a lot of ways it's even a bigger concern. I think even prior to the pandemic, citizens were always at a disadvantage, sometimes with public records requests, right? Because those that are working in newsrooms, to Todd's point, definitely working with less resources, can't always fight legal battles to get this information, but you have the power of the press. You can talk about these battles. You can publicly shame government officials when they're not giving you the information or they're breaking public records law. You can use your leverage in other ways, but the average citizen who doesn't have that kind of tool at their disposal, they're often at a loss. And, those are, the situations that I think are especially difficult because, particularly if you're in a state like Massachusetts, which doesn't have a strong public records law, there really aren't all that many, solutions to the problem. So the best, advice I can give is just to be persistent, to reach out to organizations like ours or reach out to journalists in their community and really publicize the need for this information and how these requests aren't being fulfilled. But to your point, Jordan, citizens that aren't in newsrooms that are just looking for this information for their own, personal use, I think in a lot of ways they're at a disadvantage because they don't have that power or that leverage to, or those, pre-existing relationships with sources to get the information that they need. It's a real struggle sometimes.
If just to add to that, I totally agree with that. But if I were a citizen trying to get information, I would use the leverage I have, which is I'm a constituent and I vote. So I want to I'll talk to the mayor's office or town clerk's office or a city council person or somebody who's elected and ask their staffers for help. And rather than going first, filing a formal request saying, hey, I'm trying to find this information. Can you help me? And most elected officials have either personally or they have staffers who want to help voters and constituents because they want to get reelected. And if citizens approach it that way and try to work cooperatively with their elected officials to try to get information, that can also sometimes be very successful.
That's great.
Yeah, I agree. It's something that I think we should all keep in mind. The public records requests, getting information from government, it doesn't always have to be adversarial. Like you can have respectful conversations, and oftentimes taking that approach, like Todd mentioned, can be fruitful and get you the information that you requested.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask about the average citizen. If I'm a person attending a meeting, like my Board of Selectmen or City Council, something, a meeting on Zoom, what kind of rules are different? Are any rules different in terms of gathering documents that they go over or recording what they say? Can you talk a little bit more about that, Justin, and then talk?
Sure. So every state has its own open meeting laws. So rather than going into the weeds on those laws, I think what we should be focusing on really are best practices and making sure that government has all of the tools they need to provide the public as much access as possible. Because I think particularly with the open meetings and particularly early on in the pandemic, most of the problems that I heard about, they weren't issues where officials were going out of their way to be secretive. It was more of a learning curve that we were encountering, or tech problems that were really making the experience difficult. And those communities that I saw, excel during this time were those where those constituents, those community members were actively engaged in the process, telling their town boards, for example, what worked, what didn't, what information was needed prior to a particular meeting, and really taking an active role in making sure that those meetings were open and proceeded in a way where the public could have access. Because again, I think most government officials are trying to do the right thing and trying to do a good job, but particularly during this pandemic, they were faced with circumstances few, if any, have ever encountered before. The technology was new for many of them, and the advice was welcomed. So there weren't always these bad motives at play. There were in some cases, but most of the time it was just a matter of figuring out what those best practices were and engaging with the community in a way to make sure that they were followed and that every meeting could be improved on and ultimately access was given.
How about for you, Todd? I mean, like, what about like, I'm sure you do a lot of, going to courthouses and grabbing documents there. I mean, they're closed, right? So what are people doing about stuff?
Yeah, so the courts have started to make uh, hearings online, but there is a challenge in how do you even find out about the hearings when you can't visit the courthouse and see the list of cases and hearings publicly posted. I totally agree with Justin. I don't think we should ascribe bad motives when information isn't available or we can't attend a meeting. There is a learning curve. Government agencies need to change their processes to make them available to everyone. Sometimes people aren't thinking about journalists trying to access meetings or average citizens. Sometimes they're just thinking about the elected officials or judges or lawyers, whoever's normally attending. And so I think we need to remember these are people. Most are just trying to do a good job and do their best in very difficult times, and let them know when there's a problem and try to work with them to figure out a solution. And maybe it's sending an email, get an email list with information for meetings. Maybe it's putting it on a certain website, but they have to create new ways to make both documents and meetings publicly available. And I think it behooves all of us to try to work with government officials to find ways to do that.
So what I'm hearing from you both is kind of a shared onus on elected officials, administrations, agencies, and ourselves to hold each other accountable and try to get information. Is that correct to say?
I would say so, though, with with the caveat that our patience as members of the public should only extend so far. If our government, if changes aren't happening at a reasonable pace, and meetings aren't occurring in ways that could provide access over a certain amount of time, well then the burden really is on our government officials to make those changes happen and provide that access. But at least initially, and maybe within some communities even still now, I do think there's some shared burden there, on behalf of the public to really engage. And likewise, I think it's, we should be expecting government officials to be taking these suggestions and listening to their constituents, and then putting all of those suggestions to action as well, right? Because our suggestions and the comments we make, can only go so far. We actually need to be listened to, taken seriously, and then have those improvements made.
One thing I've personally found helpful, both making informal requests as well as filing formal public records requests, is to point out when other agencies have a better process and are providing this information. I find that there've actually been studies finding that a number of government agencies tend to really give in to peer pressure. So if they find out that all the cities around them are making meetings readily available and information on their website, they're more likely to do it. If they find out that every other agency is providing police reports or some basic document on demand on their website or through email, then they're more likely to do it because they don't want to be the outlier. So I think that can be very helpful. There are obstinate officials, unfortunately, who think records are their personal property, and there are agencies that are really resistant. I think most are helpful, and when they're not, then we have to look through other remedies, whether it's an appeals process like Massachusetts and Connecticut have, or going to the courts and filing a lawsuit. But most government agencies and officials, I think, have good intentions, and if you can point to other examples where their peers are providing that information in a better way, it's really helpful.
Yeah, I agree. I would say early on in the pandemic, when certain states weren't releasing case information by town, local information, that's something that we did. So in Maine, for example, which was one of the last states to provide town-by-town data, we would point to other states like Connecticut and say, this is what they're doing. This is the data that they're providing every day, and the sky hasn't fallen. I think a lot of times when it comes to releasing data and public records, particularly during a pandemic and a public health crisis, there are concerns, some justified, some not, but concerns about the privacy of individuals. So if you can address those concerns, like Todd suggested, by showing others are releasing this data, no privacy has been infringed, we're all better off for it, and then I think you make a much stronger argument and more likely to prevail in getting that information.
Yeah, so Justin, you mentioned Rhode Island being doing a really poor job, and Connecticut doing a really good job. Can we get more hyper local? I mean, in Massachusetts, what are some? I mean, for example, how's Boston fare with a place like Worcester or Lexington or Fall River? I mean, what are some examples here locally in Massachusetts that are doing good compared to others that are doing bad?
Yeah, so throughout the last several months, I've just from speaking to everyone, and I guess I'll address the pandemic specifically, because as we all know, preaching to the choir, the Massachusetts Public Records Law of all New England states is probably the worst. It's one of the worst in the country. A lot of improvements need to be made. But given that, how did Massachusetts respond, specific to the pandemic compared to other states? From what I've heard and what we've seen, it's been fairly middle of the road. The extensions that were made as far as the public records law was concerned seemed reasonable relative to other states. The open meeting law, executive orders really encouraged municipalities and agencies to have remote meetings and give access. That said, there was one glaring hole in that if municipalities couldn't afford the technology, which is hard to fathom because this technology isn't very expensive at this point, but if they couldn't afford that technology and they made all reasonable efforts to provide access, then they were forgiven, which is a glaring hole. But still, in other parts of the executive order, that type of remote access was encouraged. Access to the governor wasn't curtailed nearly as much as, say, it was in Rhode Island. There were still, in-person press briefings. I think many of them were held outside and socially distanced, but journalists could attend in person and ask questions live. So relative to other states, it seems to be, middle of the road, if not a little bit better than others. The release of data, I would say maybe might fall a little bit short. I hold Connecticut up just as the leader within New England, but I don't want to, get too carried away with that. They certainly, I think, did a good job initially and throughout providing day-to-day data. They were one of the first states to provide localized data. I think they were one of the first states to provide data based on race and ethnicity. So it certainly seemed that Connecticut was, the leader within New England in that respect. But compared to Massachusetts, which took a while to provide even town by town data. I think the initial directive, it was confusing, right? I believe the governor said, state officials said, we're not going to release town by town data. But then they took a step back and said, yeah, but if those, individual towns want to release it, then they can. So we had this weird situation initially where some towns were releasing their own data while the state was only releasing it by county. There wasn't much consistency. And as a result, it was really difficult to get any kind of clear, idea as to just how many cases were happening across the state and where. So I think that was a mistake that was made. I question whether if it wasn't for the reporting, what happened to the Globe, the Globe's reporting on what was happening at nursing homes and other areas where there were these cluster outbreaks. I question if that reporting didn't occur, whether or not the state would have been as quick to, I should put quick in, air quotes, but, I wonder whether or not they eventually would have released case data, in those specific locations. So there were certainly a lot of, I think, missteps, but across the board, there were, missteps in all states as they were trying to figure it out. So relatively speaking, I would give it a C+, B-.
So Todd, you talked about kind of public shaming to get people providing pressure. So let's name names. I mean, who are some of the people in Massachusetts who are doing it right, and who are some of them that are doing it wrong in terms of being open and transparent?
Well, I think there are both positive and negative reviews about state public health agencies. I think they haven't provided as much information as the law requires and as much information as journalists would want. They would say that they're being barraged by requests for information right now and have provided more information than many states. So they're mixed reviews. And Governor Baker obviously is the elected official who oversees the state public health agencies. Police departments vary a lot. There have long been fights with the state police over records, and that's continued. There's long been fights with Boston Police and some other departments in Massachusetts over records, and that has continued. So we saw it was difficult to get records before, and now that there's heightened interest in criminal justice and how things are working, we're seeing the same thing. We're seeing difficulty and challenges getting information from Massachusetts courts. That is not new, but there's heightened interest in how the criminal justice system is working. So we're seeing the same problems just under, I think, a bigger spotlight, because there's huge interest in this area. For instance, whether there's racial disparities in the way that police and judges and prosecutors are doing their jobs. I think my sense is that New England in general has had less access to law enforcement records than in Florida, Ohio, and many other parts of the country. And that makes it really difficult to get records showing how states and how departments are doing. But there are also lots of local departments that are much more open and extremely helpful. So it varies a lot. Massachusetts alone has 400 police departments. And if you look across New England, it's maybe it's double that, maybe Justin knows, but it's a much greater number. And attitudes and culture can vary a lot from one department to another. There are people who are really helpful in providing information, and others are more stubborn.
Yeah, and I think that I was just going to say, I think that what Todd's describing in Massachusetts, I don't think that's uncommon. I think you find similar situations in other states as well. New Hampshire comes to mind, where I remember one reporter going to a local police department asking for some very basic public records, and their response was, due to COVID-19, we're not fulfilling any requests right now. That's just the response you're going to get from some. Others are going to be more understanding. And, to one of our earlier points, I think a lot of it just comes down to who you're asking records from, what kind of relationship you have with them, and ultimately what kind of leverage you have to play to get that information.
I'm going to ask you, Justin, have you been dealing with a lot of questions around police recently and access to them more than normal? Or?
Say that one more time, Jordan. I'm sorry.
Have you been dealing with a lot more requests, issues with people trying to access information on police?
Yeah, so getting information can always be difficult. As Todd just mentioned, I think within New England, it's always been a challenge to get public records, to get access to open meetings at times. So we're always fielding questions. The most common questions that we were getting during the pandemic was, just how is all of this going to play out? What do these executive orders mean? What is this going to look like, day to day as I'm asking for certain information or trying to log into a Zoom meeting? There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of clarity needed about the logistics of these changes. So that's really where we were focused, especially during that first month or so, as these executive orders started rolling out throughout the New England states, trying to determine, well, what does this mean? How can we work within the perimeters that these orders have laid out, and what are the expectations moving forward?
So it sounds like a lot of departments and people who were difficult before are kind of continuing in that fashion. But I mean, either of you, I guess we'll start with Todd first. Are there any egregious examples that are beyond the pale, and how do reporters go about dealing with that? Someone just blatantly ignoring, common norms.
I saw Christine Wilmson, the investigative editor at WBUR, responded to a tweet noting that it's been months and MEMA, Massachusetts Emergency Agency, hasn't responded to a request that she's had. And certainly there have been departments that are just ignoring requests. In Massachusetts, you have a couple options. You can file an appeal with the Secretary of State's office, or you can also file a lawsuit, but there are other options. You can write about it, and that puts pressure on agencies. You can you can go up the food chain to their supervisor or boss, or ultimately the elected official, whether it's mayor or governor or what other person. And sometimes they're responsive and helpful. Sometimes other agencies have the very same records, and so you can just go to another agency that's more cooperative. So there are other tools that you can do when agencies are really stubborn. But unfortunately, the pandemic hasn't made agencies that were stubborn be more cooperative.
Right.
Yeah, I think it really holds true. You know, I've heard so often during the pandemic that this crisis has really exposed the cracks in our country, whether it's race relations, healthcare, childcare, education. It's really exposed a lot of the things that we need to improve on within our country, and transparency is no different. You know, those that weren't up to par aren't during the pandemic, and I don't think we can expect them to be unless we really increase the pressure that we put on them and publicize these public record battles, particularly.
So Justin, what kind of changes do you think there will be because of this pandemic? I mean, it sounds like one of the biggest things you mentioned was just people didn't know how to do virtual meetings and all that. Do you think there's going to be new training when it comes to open meeting law, public records? Do you foresee that, or?
Yeah, so I think just based on the conversations that are having now, I think moving forward, you're going to see a lot more government meetings online. You're going to see a lot more remote access. It's happening already, and with time, I think we can expect, or at least hope, that the technology and the logistics are going to get better. I think we've all seen the benefits of the technology. So there's a lot of conversations now about, well, you know, when we get to a point where we can meet in person safely, will we continue to have the remote access, you know, feature? Will we continue to provide that? And I think we're going to see a lot of you know, municipalities say yes, you know, we're going to continue to provide that. My hope is that they have that along with in-person meetings. I think there's some value to being in person, particularly as a reporter, and getting that, you know, that face-to-face time and you know, asking questions that way. But I do think a benefit of this will be to have the remote access provided alongside the in-person meeting, and providing that level of accessibility that just wasn't there before.
Todd, do you share that view?
I think that we need to I agree that we need to continue to put pressure on organizations to provide information. And the more that we can stress how useful and important this information is to the public, I think the more successful we'll be, because reporters and journalists by themselves are a really small constituency. But when you think about all the people we're representing, or we can make a good case and just explain that we're not badgering them in the time of a pandemic, and we understand that they're overloaded, and be empathetic, but also stress the importance of this information to the public and the lawmakers and citizens and people trying to make decisions for their family, the better success we will have getting this information. I see there are also a couple questions now in the chat.
Oh, wow. Thank you for alerting that to me. My apologies. All right. So let's see. Let's get to it then. Let me just start from the beginning. Okay, now I get some technical issues. So I guess I'll just start with the first question I see is from Cindy. So Cindy, I'm going to unmute your mic, and you can ask your question. Cindy, are you there?
Oh, sorry. Did you hand that to me?
Oh, sorry. I meant to hand it to Cindy.
Okay.
My apologies for that.
Unmute. Okay. I'm
Cindy,
unmuted.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So I wrote this on Twitter to Todd, but just briefly, there's a back in this is February, maybe the end of January, I asked for a legible copy of a records request that I had already received from the town of Milton. And in June, I hadn't received it yet, giving them time, to try to be sympathetic for the pandemic. So I wrote to the Secretary of State asking for their help and to do an appeal. Haven't heard from the Secretary of State. So I don't know if anyone else is having problems getting the Secretary of State to answer, but I am.
So I have some experience filing appeals with the Secretary of State's office. I think I've filed more than 300. They have a checklist of items that you need to file an appeal, including a copy of your request. And unfortunately, if you didn't keep a copy of your original request, you're out of luck. You don't meet their criteria. So what you would need to do is file a new request and keep a copy. And then if they don't respond within 10 business days, then you have the option to appeal.
Yeah, I did have it, and I actually had the response from the town of Milton the day that I sent it. They kind of have an automatic response. So
okay.
I sent that, and like I say, that was beginning of June, and nothing from the Secretary of State.
So I would also call, because occasionally I have emailed an appeal and it just got lost. It got overlooked. So if you bring it to their attention and point out that you emailed it, they will usually be able to find it and start an appeal.
Okay, and I just find the phone number online somewhere?
Yeah, it's the Secretary of State's website, and they have a public records division.
Okay.
You could also call the main number and they'll direct you. You can also email them as well.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Cindy. Justin, do you want to add anything to that, or should I just move on to the next question?
No, it sounds like Todd covered it. Good luck, Cindy.
Good luck, Cindy. Yeah. All right, John. Sorry about that. I just realized you actually had asked your question beforehand. So, John, I think I unmuted you now. Can you ask your question? Go ahead, John.
Yeah, all set. Thank you. Yeah, I'm curious about when the town declares a state of emergency, and as our town did, a lot of authority is handed over to that team. Ours consists of both elected and administrative officials, but there's no visibility into their meetings, and I'm just wondering what kind of obligations that kind of group has to communicate its deliberations. Are they required to keep minutes? And if so, are they treated right now as essentially executive sessions that will be released at some future time? I just haven't found any information on that in my prowling through Mass General laws and recent legislation.
Any of you guys want to take a whack at that?
Yeah, John, I don't have an answer regarding the minutes, but I'm happy to look into it and follow up with more information. The town's emergency management plan, however, being a document, perhaps that's something you could use the public records law as a tool to get access to. I would think that document itself should be public, regardless of whether or not there are minutes taken under the open meeting law. Is that something you've already requested?
I've made, informal inquiries to people I know who are on that board, and the one answer I got was that they really don't want to make it public because they don't want bad guys to know their plan. That was the answer I got.
Yeah.
And I was also told if I requested it, it would probably, large portions would be blacked out because there is personal information in there, with names and addresses and members of the team and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so they might be right on the second point, but I would, if I were in your shoes, I would request it anyways and put the burden on them to redact whatever information they think is exempt, and then you can parse through that exempt information to try to find out if there's anything that shouldn't have been exempt. But at least you'll have the document, and you can work from there. Again, just because they don't want to release it doesn't mean they shouldn't, or that they're not obligated to under the law. So it certainly can't hurt to make that request and see what you get back.
Okay, thanks.
So one aspect I've also found for many of those types of coalitions is you can also ask for a list of members if you don't have it already, and ask all of them. Maybe somebody would give you the full report if too much of it's redacted, or explain your interest in just finding out what's going on, and maybe you could persuade somebody to provide updates. But I found with a large enough group of people, usually somebody will be more willing to share information and realizes the public interest in that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so important. And
Point,
John, I'm sure you already have, but the more focus you can put on the public interest, I think the stronger your arguments become, and the more likely you might be to convince somebody in the group to give you the information that you're looking for, because ultimately that's what it's about. There's a public interest here in getting this information and knowing what this management team is doing.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, John. I'm going to make a call out again for any other questions that we have. I know we have about 6 minutes left in the presentation, so just want to, again, if you guys have a question, just write it down in the chat. I'll be sure to unmute you. I do want to bring up an issue someone brought up to me. I thought it was interesting. Someone who works for a local paper was talking about how there was a neighborhood group who had a candidates debate, and for some reason, only 3 out of the 4 candidates were invited to participate. And I guess her publication has profiled all 4 candidates, and she didn't receive the invitation to the debate. She only found out about it through Facebook. Do you think that there's any issue with that? The fact that some kind of like candidate discussion would exclude a candidate in that running, and not even engage with a reporter covering that?
So if I understand you right, Jordan, there was a debate for candidates in a local election. Only 3 of the 4 were invited to be in it, with no notice given to the 4th candidate. So
right, and I guess the publication that this person works for has covered all 4 candidates. So she was thinking there might be some kind of picking and choosing going on there. Is there anything wrong with that, or what do you think?
I mean, it's hard to know without more information, but this might be a good use of the public records law to start asking for emails surrounding the conversation about who to include in the debate, the planning of the debate, and see if you can expose what the reasoning was for excluding that particular candidate.
Another thing I've heard also is there's also been instances where people have been acting inappropriately during Zoom meetings. For example, there was an instance where I guess one of the elected officials was physically drunk and drinking during one of the meetings, and it was actually covered. Is there anything that you guys have seen or heard about people acting improperly during these meetings, and how do we go about them?
One of the officials in the meeting was drinking during the meeting. Is there?
Yeah.
Was that reported? I mean, that's a huge story in itself.
I believe it was. Yeah, I believe it was. I mean, I don't know. I know the reporter. She's on here right now. If she wants to speak more to it, but I mean, if she wants to, I'll definitely be able to unmute her. So if you want to speak to her, I can unmute you. Just let me know. But yeah, so I mean, what have you guys heard about people acting improperly, or just things that have been going on during these public meetings that wouldn't normally happen? How do we navigate through that?
So I remember one case, I think it was Randolph School Board years ago, had a meeting where one of the board members performed a magic trick with a bra that was supposed to be another board member's bra. It was terribly embarrassing. It was broadcast on local community television, and when the local newspaper and others tried to get copies, the town refused to provide it, saying it would be a violation of privacy rights of the board members during their public meeting. And the supervisor of records at the time in Massachusetts upheld that decision, and was one of the reasons why that person was a nominee for IRE's National Award for withholding information, the Golden Padlock. I do not think the current supervisor of records or any judge would find the same way. Generally, records of public meetings are records, and indeed, a couple reporters in other states have even gotten copies of city council members' browsing history during meetings. So there have been a couple cases where members of boards have been accused of shopping on shopping sites or looking at other things that had nothing to do with the meeting, and they were able to get a copy of the browsing history to verify that.
From this pandemic, and where do we go from here? So, Todd, I want to start with you and let Justin lead us out of this question today.
Well, Justin alluded to this earlier, but the pandemic, I think, is exposing all the weaknesses in the system and all the problems. So when we really need information on how police departments are performing, many reporters and activists and citizens are having trouble getting that information. When we need information about what's happening in a public health emergency, it's really important to have rules and laws, and more importantly, a culture of transparency so people can get the information that we need. And I think it's also a good time to remind people of the importance of that information. Right now there's a bill, for instance, in Massachusetts pending that would make some increase accessibility to some types of police disciplinary records that are not currently public. Connecticut, I believe, just broadened their laws to some types of police records, and there are moves in many other states. So it is a good time to remind people of how this information is important, and it may be an opportunity to try to fix some of these cracks in the system going forward.
Thanks, Todd. Justin, how about yourself?
Yeah, to follow that up, the burden is on all of us. And I think the last several months have really reminded us that whether we work in a newsroom or whether we're just a concerned citizen trying to figure out what's going on in our community, the burden is really on us to ask for that information and more so fight for that information and work with our government to make sure that our communities are informed. Because otherwise it's not going to get done. If we don't push for that transparency, these conversations, these records, they'll continue to be maintained in secrecy, and we'll never know what our government is doing on our behalf, or oftentimes not on our behalf. But that really, unfortunately, comes down to just how persistent we, the public, can be in asking for this information, demanding it, and making sure that ultimately we get it. And there are a lot of organizations that and individuals that have this, common interest and are there to help. Todd is one of them. The Boston Globe does great work, as do a number of news organizations and media outlets throughout the entire region. There are advocates, like NEFAC, SBJ, and E. We're all here to help and all have this common purpose of pursuing transparency. So I really think, if nothing else, the pandemic has reminded us that this is a burden that we all share, and that we need to find ways to continue to work together to make sure that we have the information that we need and that we're entitled to under the law.
Well, thanks so much today again for your time, guys. This is a great way to help us navigate through our new normal. So Justin of the New England First Amendment Coalition, thanks again, and Todd of the Boston Globe, thanks again.